The winter of 1884 was unforgiving in Dakota Territory. Snow fell like judgment, burying dreams and hope beneath its merciless weight. In this frozen wasteland, a young woman trudged through knee-deep drifts, her threadbare coat barely shielding the life growing within her. Emmeline Grace had knocked on 17 doors that week, each one slamming shut before her pleas could find purchase. Her husband lay cold in the ground, her family scattered to the winds, and her belly grew rounder with each passing day. The 18th door belonged to Stonewall Ranch, where the legendary Magnus Creed ruled over thousands of acres, like a king without a kingdom. When she collapsed at his gate, neither could have imagined this moment would change everything. But what happens when a woman with nothing to lose meets a man who's forgotten how to hope? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Magnus Creed stood at his study window, watching the blizzard rage across his vast domain. At 42, he commanded respect from every corner of Dakota Territory, his name spoken with reverence by cattlemen and fear by those who crossed him. The Stonewall Ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, 20,000 acres of prime grazing land that had made him one of the wealthiest men west of the Mississippi. Yet tonight, surrounded by luxury that most could only dream of, he felt as empty as the howling wind outside. The gold wedding band on his finger caught the lamplight, a reminder of promises that death had rendered meaningless. 3 years had passed since Sarah's fever took her, along with their unborn son, but Magnus wore the ring still. Some habits he'd learned were harder to break than wild horses. A sharp rap at the door interrupted his brooding. "Mr. Creed." His foreman's voice carried urgency that made Magnus turn from the window. "Come in, Holt." The weathered cowboy stepped inside, snow melting from his coat onto the Persian rug. "Sir, we got a situation at the front gate. There's a woman out there, collapsed right in the snow. Looks to be with child." Magnus's jaw tightened. "Drunk?" "No, sir, don't appear so. Looks more like she's starving. Been walking in this weather for God knows how long." Holt shifted uncomfortably. "Martha's already got the guest room ready. Took the liberty. Figured you'd want her brought inside." The mention of his housekeeper's presumption should have irritated Magnus, but Martha had been with the family since before his marriage. She'd earned the right to certain liberties, especially when it came to matters of Christian charity. Still, he hesitated. Stonewall Ranch wasn't a way station for every wanderer who lost their way. She say what she wants? Hasn't said much of anything, sir. Barely conscious when we found her, but... Holt paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's got that look about her, Mr. Creed, the kind that says she's been through hell and kept walking anyway." Magnus understood that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. "Bring her in. But she's gone when the storm passes." "Yes." "Sir?" Holt turned to leave, then stopped. "There's something else." She was clutching this. He held up a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Looks like a baby blanket, hand-knitted. Only thing she had besides the clothes on her back." Something twisted in Magnus's chest at the sight of the tiny blanket. It reminded him too much of the nursery upstairs, still decorated in yellow and white, still waiting for a child who would never come home. "Take it to Martha. She'll know what to do." When Holt left, Magnus poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and settled into his leather chair. The house felt different already, disrupted by the presence of a stranger. He'd grown accustomed to the silence, the predictable rhythm of his solitary existence. Rise before dawn, check the herds, review the books, eat dinner alone while reading cattle market reports. It was a life stripped of surprise, of hope, of the messy complications that came with caring about another human being. The sound of footsteps in the hallway above made him look toward the ceiling. Martha was settling their unexpected guest, no doubt clucking over her like a mother hen. His housekeeper had been after him for months to take more interest in the community, to consider remarrying, to stop treating Stonewall Ranch like a mausoleum. Perhaps this was her way of forcing his hand. Magnus finished his whiskey and climbed the stairs, pausing outside the guest room door. Through the crack, he could see Martha tucking blankets around a slight figure, her movements gentle and practiced. The woman on the bed was younger than he'd expected, probably not yet 25, with dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Even unconscious and worn by hardship, there was something about her face that spoke of quiet strength. "How is she?" he asked softly. Martha looked up, her grey eyes warm with compassion. "Poor little thing is half frozen and hasn't eaten properly in weeks, I'd guess. But she's strong. The baby seems to be doing well, considering." She smoothed the blanket with motherly care. She stirred a bit when I was cleaning her up, mumbled something about being grateful for kindness. Did she say her name? Emmeline, I think. Emmeline Grace. Martha studied his face. "She'll need proper care, Mr. Creed. This isn't something that fixes itself with one hot meal and a warm bed." Magnus nodded, though something in him resisted the implication. He'd learned that caring for others was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not when loss came so easily and cut so deep. Better to maintain distance, to offer what help he could without becoming invested in the outcome. But as he looked at the woman sleeping in his guest room, something stirred that he'd thought buried. With Sarah, not attraction exactly, but recognition. Here was someone who understood what it meant to carry on when the world had stripped away everything that mattered. Someone who knew that survival sometimes required walking through storms that would break lesser souls. "See that she has whatever she needs," he said finally. "But Martha, she leaves when she's well enough to travel." The housekeeper's knowing smile followed him down the hallway as he retreated to his study, already regretting the complications he'd invited into his carefully ordered world. Morning light filtered through frost-etched windows as Emmeline Grace stirred beneath layers of wool blankets softer than anything she'd known in months. For a moment, the warmth and comfort felt like a dream, until the gentle movement within her belly reminded her of reality. She was alive, and so was her child. The room around her spoke of understated wealth. Polished oak furniture, thick carpets, and walls adorned with paintings of pastoral scenes. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, filling the space with golden light and blessed warmth. On the nightstand beside her sat a tray with bread, jam, and what appeared to be real butter, luxuries she hadn't tasted since before Thomas's death. A soft knock interrupted her wonder. "Come in," she called, her voice still hoarse from the cold. An older woman entered, her silver hair pinned neatly, and her dress practical but well-made. Kind eyes assessed Emmeline with the efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for others. "Good morning, dear. I'm Martha Sullivan, the housekeeper here at Stonewall Ranch. How are you feeling?" Emmeline struggled to sit up, conscious of her worn nightgown and tangled hair. "Better, thank you. I'm afraid I don't remember much from last night. Did Mr. Creed—" "Is he the one who brought me in?" "He ordered it done," Martha said, adjusting the pillows behind Emmeline's back with maternal care. "Though it was Holt and the boys who carried you. You gave us quite a fright, collapsing at the gate like that. How long had you been walking in that storm?" "I'm not sure. Days, perhaps." Emmeline's hand moved instinctively to her rounded belly. "I kept thinking I just needed to find one more door, one more person willing to help. I never expected—" She gestured around the luxurious room. Martha's expression softened. "Well, you're safe now. That's what matters. Now let's get some proper food into you. You're eating for two, after all." As Martha busied herself arranging the breakfast tray, Emmeline noticed her movements held a particular reverence for the room's furnishings. There was something deliberate about how she avoided looking toward a corner where a rocking chair sat draped in dusty sheets. "Mrs. Sullivan," Emmeline began carefully, "please tell Mr. Creed how grateful I am for his kindness. I know I'm an unexpected burden, and I don't want to impose longer than necessary." "Nonsense. You're hardly a burden." Martha paused in her ministrations, studying Emmeline's face. "Though I suppose Magnus, Mr. Creed, that is, might see it differently. He's not much for company these days." "Has he always been so solitary?" Martha's hand stilled on the tray. Not always, no. This house used to ring with laughter. His wife Sarah had the most musical laugh, could hear it from 3 rooms away. But that was before... She trailed off, seeming to catch herself. Before what? Before the fever took her and their unborn child 3 years past. Changed him, it did. Made him hard in ways that don't come natural to a man with his heart. Martha's voice carried the weight of shared grief. Some folks cope with loss by reaching out to others. Magnus built walls instead. Emmeline felt a pang of recognition. After Thomas's death, she'd wanted nothing more than to retreat from the world, to find a quiet corner where grief couldn't reach her. Only the life growing inside her had kept her moving forward, kept her knocking on doors, even when hope seemed foolish. "The baby," she said quietly. It must be difficult for him, having a pregnant woman in his home. Difficult, yes, but maybe necessary too. Martha's knowing look suggested she saw more than she let on. Sometimes the good Lord puts people in our path when we need them most, even if we don't realize it at the time. Through the window, Emmeline could see the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow. The ranch stretched endlessly toward rolling hills, its buildings, connected by neat pathways, already being cleared by industrious hands. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest tight with longing, not just for shelter, but for belonging to something larger than her own desperate survival. "Mrs. Sullivan, how long do you think Mr. Creed will allow me to stay? Until you're well enough to travel, I expect. Though between you and me," Martha leaned closer conspiratorially, "I think you might find Magnus Creed has a softer heart than he lets on. He's been alone too long, rattling around this big house like a ghost haunting his own life." As if summoned. By their conversation, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Martha straightened, smoothing her apron. "That'll be him now, checking on you. He's been pacing the floors since dawn, pretending he's not worried about how you're faring." The footsteps paused outside the door, and Emmeline found herself holding her breath, preparing to meet the man who'd saved her life. She touched the baby blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed, her only remaining connection to the life she'd lost, and wondered what this meeting would bring to the uncertain future she carried within her. The knock came soft but deliberate. Emmeline smoothed her borrowed dress, one of Martha's that had been hastily altered, and called for him to enter. Magnus Creed filled the doorway with a presence that seemed to draw all the air from the room. He was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor despite his obvious wealth. His dark hair showed threads of premature silver, and his eyes held the guarded intensity of a man who'd learned to measure every word, every gesture. "Mrs. Grace," his voice carried the rough edges of the frontier, tempered by education, "I trust Martha has seen to your needs." "More than adequately, Mr. Creed. I can't express my gratitude for your kindness." Emmeline rose carefully from the chair where she'd been sitting, conscious of how her condition must appear to him. "I know my presence here is an imposition." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, at her directness. "You're welcome to stay until the weather clears, and you're strong enough to travel. Martha tells me you haven't been eating properly. Food has been scarce lately." She kept her voice steady, though the memory of empty cupboards and locked doors threatened to break her composure. "I've been traveling since my husband passed, looking for work, for a place to make a new start." Magnus's gaze dropped briefly to her hands, noting the thin gold band she still wore. "I'm sorry for your loss. What was your husband's trade?" "Thomas was a farmer, though he had a mind for business too. We had a small place outside Deadwood, raising wheat and keeping a few head of cattle. When the blight took the crops, and then the fever took him." She paused, steadying herself. "I tried to keep the farm running, but a woman in my condition alone, it proved impossible. The land, sold to pay his debts. There wasn't much left after the creditors took their due." Emmeline's hand moved to her belly protectively. Who kept only what I could carry, and started walking." Magnus studied her with new interest. This wasn't the desperate drifter he'd expected, but a woman who'd known prosperity, and lost it to circumstances beyond her control. There was education in her speech, dignity in her bearing, despite her current straits. Where were you headed? Billings. Initially, I heard there might be work in the hotels there, cleaning or cooking, but the storm came, and I lost the road. She met his eyes directly. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Creed. If there's work here I can do to earn my keep, even. For a few days, I'd be grateful for the chance. The request clearly caught him off guard. Magnus had expected tears, pleas for extended sanctuary, the kind of emotional manipulation he'd grown cynical about since Sarah's death. Instead, this woman offered to work for her bread. You're carrying a child. Heavy labor is out of the question. I'm pregnant, not invalid. I've been managing for myself these past months. There was steel beneath the softness in her voice. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend to minor injuries. On our farm, I help Thomas with the books and correspondence. I'm not afraid of honest work. Magnus found himself genuinely considering the offer, which surprised him. The ranch always needed extra hands, especially in the house. Martha wasn't getting any younger, and the place was larger than one woman could properly manage, but hiring a pregnant woman seemed foolhardy at best. What about when the child comes? That's still months away. I'm not asking for promises beyond that. Emmeline lifted her chin slightly. I'd rather earn my place here than accept charity, however kindly meant. Before Magnus could respond, a commotion erupted in the courtyard below. Raised voices and the sound of running feet drew them. Both to the window, a ranch hand was limping toward the house, supported by two others, blood seeping through a makeshift bandage around his leg. Accident at the north fence, one of the men called up. Wire snapped and caught Jake across the shin. Looks bad. Magnus turned toward the door, then stopped as Emmeline moved past him. Where are you going? To help, she was already gathering her skirts. I told you I could tend to injuries. Mrs. Grace, you don't understand. Jake's hurt badly and there's no doctor within 50 miles. Emmeline paused at the door, fixing him with a look that held more authority than he'd expected from someone in her position. Mr. Creed, my grandmother was a midwife and healer. She taught me to set bones, stitch wounds, and mix medicines from whatever herbs could be found. I've birthed babies, treated fever, and saved more than one man from bleeding to death. Your ranch hand needs help, and I can provide it. Without waiting for permission, she headed downstairs, leaving Magnus to follow in her wake. As he watched her take charge of the situation with calm efficiency, something shifted in his perception. This woman wasn't just another burden thrust upon his hospitality. She was capable, strong, and possessed of skills his isolated ranch could use. For the first time in 3 years, Magnus Creed found himself genuinely intrigued by another human being. The feeling was as unsettling as it was unexpected, like ice beginning to crack after a long, bitter winter. By evening, Jake was resting comfortably in the bunkhouse, his leg properly cleaned, stitched, and bandaged with a skill that impressed even the most seasoned ranch hands. Word of Emmeline's medical abilities spread quickly through Stonewall Ranch, and Magnus found himself fielding requests from men who'd been nursing minor ailments for weeks. He sat in his study after dinner, attempting to focus on ledger entries, but his attention kept drifting to the sounds from upstairs. Emmeline had insisted on helping Martha with the evening chores, despite protests about her condition. Their voices carried down the hallway, Martha's warm laughter mixing with Emmeline's softer responses, filling the house with a liveliness he'd forgotten it could hold. Magnus opened his leather journal, a habit he'd maintained since his father's death 15 years ago. The pages chronicled the growth of his empire, cattle prices, weather patterns, business decisions that had made him wealthy beyond most men's dreams. But tonight, for the first time in years, he found himself writing about something other than ranch business. The woman Emmeline has proven more capable than expected. Her medical knowledge rivals that of any frontier doctor I've encountered. Jake's injury would have festered without proper treatment, might have cost him the leg or worse. She worked with steady hands and calm authority, never flinching at The blood or the man's cries. There's something about her presence that changes the atmosphere of this place. The men speak more quietly, stand straighter, as if trying to be worthy of some unspoken standard she represents. He paused, pen hovering over the page, unsure why he felt compelled to record these observations. Since Sarah's death, his journal entries had been clinical, devoid of personal reflection. Yet here he was, documenting the way afternoon light caught in Emmeline's dark hair as she worked, the gentle authority in her voice when she instructed the men on Jake's care. She carries herself with dignity despite her circumstances. There's breeding there, education, though she wears her hardships like badges of honor rather than shame. Martha is already half in love with her, fussing over her condition while clearly delighting in having another woman in the house. Even Holt, suspicious of strangers by nature, speaks of her with respect. A soft knock interrupted his writing. Magnus quickly closed the journal, calling for the visitor to enter. Emmeline appeared in the doorway, looking hesitant. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Creed. Martha said I might find you here. Is something wrong? Is it Jake?" "No, he's sleeping peacefully. I wanted to speak with you about my arrangement here." She stepped into the room, her gaze taking in the masculine surroundings, the mounted rifles, the maps of cattle routes, the photographs of prize bulls. "I meant what I said about earning my keep." Magnus gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit. You've more than proven your value today. I've been thinking about what work I might do that wouldn't interfere with your usual operations." Emmeline settled carefully into the chair. "Martha mentioned that you handle much of the ranch correspondence yourself, along with the bookkeeping. I could assist with that, if you'd trust me with such responsibilities." The offer surprised him. Most women on the frontier could barely read, let alone handle business correspondence. "You have experience with accounts. Thomas and I managed our farm together. I kept the books, handled orders for seed and equipment, corresponded with buyers in Deadwood and Rapid City. I have a fair hand with figures and letters both." Magnus studied her thoughtfully. The ranch's paperwork had grown overwhelming in recent years as his holdings expanded. He'd been considering hiring a clerk from town, but the thought of training someone in his methods had seemed more trouble than benefit. The work can be demanding: cattle sales, land transactions, correspondence with buyers from Chicago to Denver. "I understand, and I realize you have no reason to trust a stranger with such important matters. Perhaps you'd allow me to start with smaller tasks. Prove my reliability." There was something in her tone that reminded him of himself in the early days when he'd been young and eager to prove his worth to skeptical cattlemen. That hunger to demonstrate capability, to be valued for more than circumstances suggested. "Very well. We'll start you with routine correspondence, filing, basic bookkeeping. If you prove competent, we'll discuss expanding your responsibilities." Relief flickered across her features. "Thank you. You won't regret this decision." "I hope not." Magnus reopened his journal, then looked up to find her still seated. "Was there something else?" "I wanted you to know that I don't take your kindness for granted. What you've done, taking in a stranger, trusting me with work, it means more than you might realize." Before he could respond, she rose and moved toward the door. At the threshold, she paused. "Your wife must have been very happy here. This house, this ranch. It has the feeling of a place built with love." The observation hit him unexpectedly hard. Sarah had said almost the same thing when he'd first brought her to Stonewall Ranch as his bride. After she left, Magnus stared at the closed door for a long time, remembering how his wife's presence had transformed cold spaces into warm ones, much as Emmeline seemed to be doing now. He picked up his pen and added one final line to the day's entry. Perhaps walls, built to keep out pain, also keep out possibility. 3 days later, Emmeline had settled into a routine that surprised everyone, including herself. Mornings found her in Magnus's study, organizing correspondence and updating ledgers with a precision that impressed him. Afternoons were spent with Martha, learning the rhythms of the great house while sharing stories and gentle laughter. But it was her evenings that had begun to draw attention from the surrounding community. Word of her healing skills had spread beyond Stonewall Ranch. Farmers and their families started arriving at sunset, seeking remedies for ailments that had plagued them through the harsh winter. Magnus watched from his study window as she examined a rancher's wife whose cough had persisted for weeks. Her hands gentle as she checked for fever and listened to the woman's breathing. "She's got the touch," Holt observed, joining Magnus at the window. "My Sarah used to say some folks are born with healing in their fingers. That little lady's got it sure enough." Magnus had never heard his foreman mention his late wife before. Sarah Holt had died in childbirth 5 years past, leaving the weathered cowboy to raise their son alone. "You think she knows what she's doing? I think she knows better than most. Watch how she moves around them, folks. Never rushing, always listening. That's wisdom, not just book learning." As if to prove his point, Emmeline emerged from the house carrying a small canvas bag. She approached the waiting families with the confidence of someone accustomed to being needed. Magnus found himself drawn downstairs, ostensibly to check on ranch business, but really to observe her work. "Mrs. Patterson," Emmeline was saying to a woman whose infant fussed restlessly in her arms, "the little one's digestion is unsettled. From the change in your milk. You mentioned you've been eating differently since the supply wagons couldn't get through." "Nothing but salt pork and beans for near 2 weeks," the woman replied wearily. "It's all we had left." Emmeline nodded knowingly. "The baby's responding to the lack of variety in your diet. I'll prepare some fennel tea for you to drink. It'll help settle both your stomachs. And here," she reached into her bag and withdrew a small bundle of dried herbs. "Chamomile and mint. Steep it weak and give the baby just a few drops. But more importantly, we need to get some fresh foods into you." She turned to Magnus, who had approached close enough to hear the conversation. "Mr. Creed, do you have any fresh vegetables in storage? Carrots, potatoes, anything with substance?" The request put him in an awkward position. His stores were extensive, but offering food to every struggling family in the territory would quickly deplete them. Yet something in Emmeline's expectant gaze made refusal difficult. "Martha keeps a good root cellar. I suppose we could spare some provisions." "Bless you," Mrs. Patterson breathed. "We'll work it off come spring, I promise." "See that you do," Magnus replied, though his tone lacked conviction. He was learning that Emmeline's presence made him generous in ways that defied practical sense. As the evening progressed, he watched her treat a child's infected cut, advise an old-timer about his arthritis, and mix a poultice for a woman whose hands were cracked from harsh weather. Each interaction revealed new depths to her knowledge, remedies that spoke of years spent learning from someone with considerable skill. When the last family departed with grateful thanks and promises to return the borrowed supplies, Magnus found Emmeline sitting on the porch steps, her hands resting on her rounded belly. "Tired?" he asked, settling beside her with careful distance. "Content," she corrected. "It feels good to be useful again. After Thomas died, I felt so purposeless, like I was just existing instead of living." "Where did you learn all this? The healing, I mean." Emmeline's eyes grew distant. "My grandmother, Nana Rose, she was the closest thing to a doctor our county had. Delivered half the babies born in 3 townships, set more broken bones than she could count. My mother died when I was 7, so Nana Rose raised me. Said I had the gift, and it would be a sin to waste it. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. Lived to be 92 and delivered her last baby at 89. Said the good Lord would take her when her work was done, not before." Emmeline smiled at the memory. "She would have liked you, I think." "Why do you say that?" "Because you build things that last. She always said the best people were the ones who left the world better than they found it. This ranch, the way you care for your people, it's a kind of healing too." Magnus felt something shift inside him at her words. He'd never thought of his work in those terms, but perhaps she was right. Perhaps providing livelihoods, building something enduring, was its own form of medicine for a world that often seemed bent on destruction. "Emmeline," he said quietly, surprising himself by using her first name. "I want you to know that you're welcome here as long as you need sanctuary. Not as charity, but because you've already proven yourself valuable to this place." Her smile, in response, was like sunlight breaking through clouds, warming something in his chest that had been cold for far too long. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that felt both natural and dangerous to Magnus. Evenings found them working together in his study, Emmeline's neat handwriting recording cattle transactions while he reviewed contracts and correspondence. The silence between them had evolved from awkward to comfortable, punctuated by discussions about ranch business that revealed her sharp mind for commerce. "The Denver buyers are offering $12 a head," Emmeline observed, reviewing the latest telegram. "But Henderson's letter suggests they're paying 15 to ranchers in Wyoming." Magnus looked up from his own papers. "Henderson exaggerates to make himself look successful. Besides, Wyoming cattle don't have to cross the territories we do. Different costs. Still, 12 seems low for prime beef. What if you held back the herd until spring? Let grass-fed cattle bring premium prices." The suggestion had merit. Magnus had considered the same strategy but dismissed it due to winter feeding costs. Yet hearing it from Emmeline made him reconsider. Feed costs would be substantial if we got snowed in and couldn't get hay deliveries. "But your southern pastures stay clear most winters, don't they? I've seen the cattle there, still grazing despite the snow elsewhere." She traced a finger along the map spread between them. "And you have that protected valley where the springs keep the ground from freezing completely." Her observation surprised him. Few visitors noticed such details about his land, let alone understood their implications. "You have a good eye for terrain. Thomas taught me to read land like some women read recipes. He said understanding your ground was the difference between prosperity and poverty." Her expression grew wistful. He would have loved this place. The scale of it, the possibilities. Magnus found himself curious about her late husband in ways that made him uncomfortable. "How long were you married?" 3 years. "We met when I was 17, married when I turned 18. He was older, more experienced with farming and business. My grandmother worried I was too young, but Thomas was patient, kind. He taught me everything about running a farm, said a good wife should. Be a partner, not just a housekeeper." There was love in her voice when she spoke of Thomas, but not the raw grief Magnus had expected. Time had gentled her loss into something resembling acceptance. "He sounds like a good man." He was. "But he's gone, and I have to think about the future now." Her hand moved to her belly, a gesture that had become habitual. "This little one will need stability, education, opportunities. I can't give those things as a traveling widow living on charity." The practical tone surprised him. Magnus had assumed her acceptance of work at Stonewall Ranch was temporary, a way to regain strength before moving on. But her words suggested longer-term planning. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that what you've built here is remarkable, not just the wealth, but the community. Your ranch hands stay for years. Their families settle nearby. Children grow up with prospects. It's what Thomas and I dreamed of creating on our little farm." She met his eyes directly. "I'd like to be part of something like this if you'd have me." The conversation was venturing into territory Magnus hadn't expected to explore. Offering temporary sanctuary was one thing. Discussing permanent arrangements implied commitments he wasn't prepared to make. Yet something in her directness appealed to him. No tears, no emotional manipulation, just honest assessment of mutual benefit. "What exactly are you proposing? Let me earn my place here properly. Give me real responsibilities, not just charity work. I'll handle your correspondence, manage household accounts, serve as ranch medic for the hands and their families. In exchange, I ask for a home for myself and my child, fair wages, and the security of knowing we belong somewhere." It was a business proposition, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to negotiating. Magnus realized she was offering him something he hadn't known he wanted. Not just help with ranch operations, but restoration of purpose to the domestic side of his life. Stonewall Ranch would feel less like a monument to loss and more like a living enterprise. And if you marry again, if some man comes along and offers you a different kind of security, Emmeline's smile held surprising warmth, then I suppose you'd need to find someone else to manage your correspondence. But Magnus, the use of his first name, sent an unexpected flutter through his chest. I'm not a 17-year-old girl anymore, dreaming of romance and rescue. I'm a woman who knows her own mind and value. Any man who'd want me would have to accept that I come with responsibilities and opinions of my own. Magnus reached into his desk drawer and withdrew his father's gold pocket watch, a symbol of the Creed legacy and the weight of building something permanent. He'd carried it every day since inheriting the ranch, a reminder of duty and continuity. Tomorrow we'll draw up proper employment papers. You'll have a real position here with wages and security. He paused, studying her face. Welcome to Stonewall Ranch, Miss Emmeline, officially. Her smile in response made the study feel warmer, as if winter itself was beginning to lose its grip on the great house. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a rider who seemed eager to be away from Stonewall Ranch as quickly as possible. Magnus broke the wax seal, while Emmeline organized the day's correspondence, neither of them suspecting how dramatically the contents would shift the comfortable routine they'd established. The letterhead bore the name of Millicent Ashford, the self-appointed social arbiter of Cedar Falls, the nearest town to the ranch. Her spidery handwriting conveyed concern, wrapped in barely disguised malice. Dear Mr. Creed, as a longtime friend of your dear departed Sarah, and a woman who holds the highest regard for the Creed family name, I feel compelled to share certain concerns that have reached my attention. Word has spread regarding your current houseguest, and I fear the implications may not have occurred to a man of your upstanding character, a pregnant woman of unknown origins residing unmarried in your home presents unfortunate opportunities for gossip among the less charitable members of our community. While I'm certain your intentions are purely Christian in nature, others may draw conclusions that could damage your reputation, and by extension your business relationships. I trust you will give this matter the consideration it deserves. Your concerned friend, Mrs. Millicent Ashford P.S. Young Mrs. Henderson mentioned seeing this woman treating the Patterson child for some ailment. I do hope you're not allowing unqualified persons to practice medicine on your property. The territorial authorities take a dim view of such activities. Magnus read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each word. He'd known that Emmeline's presence would eventually draw attention, but he'd underestimated the speed with which gossip traveled through the isolated communities. Millicent Ashford had appointed herself guardian of propriety years ago, wielding her late husband's former position as territorial judge like a weapon against anyone who failed to meet her exacting standards. Bad news? Emmeline asked, noting his expression. Magnus hesitated, then handed her the letter. Her face remained composed as she read, though he noticed her hands tighten slightly on the paper. When she finished, she folded it carefully and set it aside. I see. And what is Mrs. Ashford's standing in the community? Considerable, unfortunately. Her late husband was territorial judge for 15 years. She has connections in Denver, friends among the cattle buyers and railroad officials. A word from her could make business complicated. Emmeline nodded thoughtfully. And her suggestions? She wants you gone, quietly and quickly, before more tongues start wagging. Magnus found himself angry at having to voice such thoughts. She's threatened to involve territorial authorities about your medical practice, which is well within her rights. I have no formal credentials, only knowledge passed down from my grandmother. Emmeline's voice remained steady, but Magnus detected hurt beneath the practical tone. Perhaps it would be best if I moved on. I've saved enough from my wages to reach Billings, and spring travel will be easier. The suggestion hit Magnus harder than expected. Over the past weeks, Emmeline had become integral to both his business operations and his daily routine. The thought of returning to solitary evenings and empty conversations felt suddenly unbearable. That's one option, he said carefully, but there are others, such as... Magnus stood and moved to the window, gathering his thoughts. Outside, ranch. Hands went about their duties under a brilliant winter sky. Everything appeared normal, yet he sensed his world balanced on the edge of significant change. We could give the gossips something definite to discuss instead of allowing them to speculate. Emmeline's silence stretched long enough that he turned to face her. Her expression was unreadable, though her hands had moved protectively to her belly. "Marriage," she said quietly. "You're suggesting marriage?" "I'm suggesting a practical arrangement that would solve several problems. You'd have permanent security and social respectability. I'd have a capable partner in managing ranch operations and someone to..." He paused, struggling with words that felt inadequate. "Someone to help make this place feel like a home again, instead of a monument. And the child would be legally mine, with all the rights and protections that provides. The Creed name carries weight in this territory. No one would dare question a child bearing it." Emmeline rose and joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the lavender soap Martha favored. "What about love, Magnus? What about the kind of marriage you had with Sarah?" The question struck deeper than he'd expected. His marriage to Sarah had been built on genuine affection that had grown into profound love. What he was proposing to Emmeline was something else entirely. Practical, beneficial, but emotionally safe. "Love is a luxury I'm not sure I can afford." "Again," he said honestly, "losing Sarah nearly destroyed me. What I'm offering you is partnership, respect, security. Perhaps that's enough. And if it isn't, if one of us develops feelings the other can't return." Magnus had no answer for that. He'd built his proposal on the assumption that both of them had learned to guard their hearts, that practical considerations could substitute for emotional risk. But looking at Emmeline now, seeing the way afternoon light caught in her hair and the gentle strength in her bearing, he realized his own feelings might be less controlled than he'd believed. "I suppose," he said finally, "we'd have to trust each other to be honest about such complications." Emmeline's smile was sad and knowing. "You're asking me to marry you, Magnus Creed. That's not a business proposition, no matter how you frame it. It's two people choosing to build a life together." Before he could respond, she'd left the study, leaving him alone with the letter and the sudden understanding that his carefully ordered world was about to change irrevocably. That evening found Magnus standing before the portrait that had hung in his bedroom for 3 years, untouched and unviewed, since the day he'd sealed himself away from its memory. Sarah's painted eyes seemed to follow him as he finally forced himself to look, really look, at the face that had once been his entire world. The artist had captured her perfectly, the warm brown eyes that could sparkle with mischief or melt with compassion, the auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun copper, the gentle smile that had made even the hardest ranch hands soften their rough language in her presence. She'd been 23 when she died, forever frozen in the bloom of young womanhood, forever beyond the reach of time's changes. A soft knock interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called, knowing somehow that it would be Emmeline. She entered, hesitantly, carrying a tea service that filled the room with the scent of chamomile and mint. "Martha thought you might like some evening tea. She's concerned about you missing dinner." Magnus accepted the cup gratefully, noting how Emmeline's gaze found the portrait and lingered there with respectful curiosity. "She was beautiful," Emmeline said softly. "Yes, beautiful, kind, full of dreams about the life we'd build together." Magnus sank into the chair beside his bed, suddenly feeling every one of his 42 years. She wanted children immediately, said the house felt empty without little voices echoing through the halls. I kept telling her we had time, that we should establish the ranch first, build our fortune before starting a family. But time ran out. Time ran out, he confirmed. She caught fever in her 7th month. The doctor said the baby might have survived if we'd taken her to Denver, but by the time we realized how serious it was, he couldn't finish the sentence. Emmeline settled into the chair across from him, her own cup cradled in her hands. You blame yourself. I should have seen the signs earlier, should have insisted on better medical care, should have put her needs before my pride in handling everything ourselves. The words came easier than expected, as if speaking them aloud released some of the poison they'd accumulated in his heart. I failed her when she needed me most. Magnus. Emmeline's voice carried gentle authority. Fever takes its own course. Regardless of our efforts, I've seen strong men die despite the best care, and I've seen seemingly hopeless cases recover against all expectation. Sometimes medicine can't overcome what nature has decided. You sound like the preacher who buried them. I sound like someone who's learned that guilt is a luxury grieving people can't afford. You can honor Sarah's memory without carrying responsibility for her death. Magnus looked again at the portrait, seeing it now through different eyes. Instead of accusation, he found gentle encouragement in Sarah's painted smile. She'd always been practical about hardship, quick to move forward rather than dwelling on what couldn't be changed. She would have liked you, he said suddenly. Sarah had little patience for helpless women. She would have appreciated your strength, your independence, and she would have wanted you to be happy again. The simple statement hit him with unexpected force. He'd spent 3 years convinced that happiness would be a betrayal of Sarah's memory, that moving forward meant forgetting what they'd shared. But looking at the portrait now, he realized Sarah would never have wanted him to remain frozen in grief. I've been thinking about your proposal, Emmeline continued, about marriage as a practical arrangement. Magnus tensed, preparing for rejection. I think you're wrong about love being a luxury you can't afford. I think you're afraid that caring about someone new means diminishing what you felt for Sarah. She set down her tea and moved to stand beside the portrait. But love isn't a finite resource, Magnus. Having feelings for me wouldn't steal anything from her memory. And do you have feelings for me? Emmeline's cheeks colored slightly, but her gaze remained steady. I respect you. I admire what you've built and how you treat people. I feel safe with you in ways I haven't since Thomas died. Whether that could grow into love, she shrugged gracefully. I suppose we'd have to give it the chance to find out. Magnus rose and joined her before the portrait. Sarah's face looked peaceful, almost approving, as if she were giving her blessing to whatever came next. If we do this, he said slowly, if we marry, I want you to understand something. I'll never ask you to replace Sarah or pretend she didn't exist. This room, this portrait, the memories, they're part of who I am. I wouldn't want you to forget her. She helped make you the man I'm choosing to trust with my future. Emmeline reached out and straightened the portrait's frame with careful hands. Besides, I think she and I might have been friends. Any woman who could love you this completely must have had excellent taste. For the first time in 3 years, Magnus found himself smiling in Sarah's presence rather than grieving it. The first wildflower appeared on a Tuesday morning in late March. A brave little prairie rose, pushing through the last patches of snow near the ranch house porch. Emmeline discovered it during her morning walk, a routine she'd maintained despite her advancing pregnancy. At 7 months, her condition was unmistakable, but she moved with the same graceful determination that had characterized her arrival at Stonewall Ranch. Magnus found her kneeling beside the flower, one hand supporting her back, while the other traced the delicate petals with reverent fingers. The sight stirred something in his chest that had become increasingly difficult to ignore, not just protective instincts, but genuine tenderness for the woman who'd transformed his isolated existence into something resembling a life again. First, sign of spring, she said without looking up. Nana Rose always said wildflowers were nature's way of reminding us that beauty comes after hardship. Your grandmother sounds like she was full of wisdom. Full of something, Emmeline replied with a smile that made her whole face luminous. She used to say that every flower that bloomed despite harsh conditions was proof that hope was stronger than despair. Magnus helped her to her feet, noting how naturally his hands lingered on her arms. Over the past weeks, small touches had become commonplace between them. His hand on her elbow as they climbed stairs, her fingers brushing his. As they passed documents, moments of contact that felt both innocent and charged with possibility. "Speaking of hope," he said, "I received word from the minister yesterday. He'll be riding through next week and can perform the ceremony then, if you're still willing." They'd agreed to marriage 3 weeks ago, but the decision had felt abstract. Until now, suddenly the reality seemed immediate and substantial. Emmeline's expression grew thoughtful as she considered his words. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked. "Are you?" I asked first. Magnus smiled at her directness. It was one of the qualities he'd grown to appreciate most about her, the way she met difficult conversations head-on rather than dancing around them. "No second thoughts, but I want to be certain you understand what you're accepting. Marriage to me means becoming part of something that extends beyond just the two of us. This ranch, the people who depend on it, the legacy that will be passed down to your child. It all becomes your responsibility too." "Our child," she corrected gently. "You've made it clear you intend to claim the baby as your own." The casual possessiveness in her voice sent warmth through his chest. Over the months, he'd found himself thinking of the child not as Emmeline's burden, but as their shared future. He'd already begun making plans: a nursery in the room adjacent to their bedroom, a pony for when the child grew old enough to ride, educational opportunities that would prepare them to eventually inherit the ranch. "Our child," he agreed. "Have you thought about names?" "Some. Rose, for a girl, after my grandmother. For a boy." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "I was thinking perhaps James, after my father, but I wanted to ask if you had preferences." Magnus was touched that she'd considered his opinion on something so personal. "James is a good, strong name, and Rose suits a child who'll grow up around wildflowers and wide spaces." They walked slowly back toward the house, Emmeline's hand resting in the crook of his arm. The gesture had become natural over their weeks of evening strolls, but today it felt different, more intimate, weighted with the promise of permanent connection. "Magnus," she said as they reached the porch steps, "I need to tell you something about what I expect from this marriage." His heart skipped, fearing she'd changed her mind. "Go on. I know you've presented this as a practical arrangement, and I understand your reasons. But I want you to know that I don't intend to settle for a marriage in name only." Her cheeks colored, but her voice remained steady. "I hope we can build something real together. Partnership, affection, maybe even love in time. I won't push you beyond what you're ready to give, but I also won't pretend to be satisfied with mere companionship." The honesty in her declaration both thrilled and terrified him. Magnus had convinced himself that a comfortable, respectful partnership would be enough, but Emmeline was suggesting something far more ambitious. She was proposing they build not just a marriage, but a genuine union based on mutual care and growing intimacy, and if I'm not capable of what you're hoping for, then we'll figure it out together. But Magnus, she turned to face him fully, her dark eyes serious. "I've felt how you look at me sometimes when you think I'm not watching. I've noticed how your voice changes when you talk about our future, our child. You may think you've locked your heart away, but I believe it's still there, just waiting for permission to feel again." Before he could respond, she'd risen on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. The contact was brief, almost sisterly, but it left his skin burning and his pulse racing. "1 week," she said, stepping back, with a smile that promised everything and demanded nothing. "I'll be ready." As she disappeared into the house, Magnus touched his cheek where her lips had been, and realized that, ready or not, his heart was already opening to possibilities he'd thought lost forever. The engagement ring had belonged to Magnus's grandmother, a delicate band of white gold set with a modest but flawless diamond that caught light like captured starfire. He'd retrieved it from the safe where it had rested for over 2 decades, choosing it specifically because it carried no memories of Sarah. This would be something entirely new, untainted by past grief or future expectations. Magnus found Emmeline in the garden behind the house, where she'd been coaxing early vegetables from the rich soil, despite Martha's protests about her condition. She knelt among the neat rows of sprouting lettuce and radishes, her hands dark with earth, her face peaceful, in a way that made his chest tight with unexpected emotion. "Emmeline," she looked up at his voice, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "You sound serious. Has something happened?" in a manner of speaking. Magnus helped her to her feet, noting how she leaned into his support more than she had. Even a week ago, the baby's growth was making simple tasks increasingly difficult, though she rarely complained. "I have something for you." He withdrew the ring from his vest pocket, watching her expression change as she recognized what he held. The simple gold band caught the sunlight, modest but unmistakably precious. "Magnus, it's beautiful. It was my grandmother's. She wore it for 63 years, raised 7 children, built a life with my grandfather that lasted until death separated them." He paused, gathering courage for words that felt more significant than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. "I'm hoping it will represent something equally enduring for us." Emmeline extended her left hand, and Magnus slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting decades for her to claim it. The sight of it there, marking her as his intended bride, sent a possessive thrill through him that surprised in its intensity. "Now it's official," she said softly, admiring the way the diamonds sparkled against her work-roughened fingers. "No more speculation about my status here." "No more speculation," he agreed. "You're to be Mrs. Magnus Creed, with all the rights and protections that name carries." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. "Rights and protections. You make it sound like a business contract." Magnus realized his mistake immediately. After weeks of growing closer, of sharing evening conversations and comfortable silences, he'd reverted to the formal distance that had once felt safer. But looking at Emily now, seeing hurt flicker across her features, he understood that safety was no longer what he wanted. That came out wrong. He took her hands in his, ring and all, and felt how much smaller they were than his own. "Emmeline, when you first came here, I thought I was offering charity to a desperate woman. Then I thought I was gaining a competent employee. When the gossip started, I convinced myself I was proposing a practical arrangement. And now I realize I've been lying to myself." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, but Magnus forced himself to continue. "Somewhere along the way, this stopped being about charity or practicality. I care about you, Emmeline. Not just your welfare or your usefulness, but you, the way you hum while you work, the way you listen when people talk to you, the way you've brought laughter back to this house." Tears gathered in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd ever admit it." "You knew?" "I hoped. But hoping and knowing are different things." She moved closer, eliminating the careful distance they'd maintained. "I need to tell you something too. I didn't accept your proposal just for security, though God knows I needed it. I accepted because I'm falling in love with you." The words hit him like a physical blow, but not unpleasant, more like the shock of diving into sun-warmed water. Magnus had spent months convinced that his capacity for love had died with Sarah, but looking at Emmeline now, he felt his heart expand in ways he'd forgotten were possible. "I love you too," he said, the words coming easier than expected. "I think I have for weeks, but I was too stubborn to admit it. This time when she kissed him, it wasn't the brief sisterly contact from the week before. This was a real kiss, deep and sweet and full of promise." Magnus pulled her closer, careful of her condition, but unwilling to let distance remain between them. When they broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. 1 week feels like a very long time, Emmeline murmured against his mouth. Then we'll make it a short week, Magnus replied, and sealed the promise with another kiss that tasted of forever. The engagement ring caught the late afternoon light as their hands intertwined, a symbol not of obligation, but of choice freely made. Around them, the garden bloomed with new life, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten story, waiting for their love to fill its pages. The train ticket bore the stamp of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, dated just 3 days prior, evidence of a journey made with determined purpose. Magnus studied the crumpled paper that Holt had found discarded near the gate, his gut tightening with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. Visitors to Stonewall Ranch were rare enough that any unexpected arrival warranted attention, but something about this felt different. "Stranger came through about an hour ago," Holt reported, his weathered face creased with concern. Well-dressed fellow, riding a good horse but pushing it hard, looked like he'd been traveling fast for days, asked specific questions about Mrs. Grace. Magnus felt ice form in his veins. What kind of questions? Whether she was here? How long she'd been staying? What her situation was? Holt's careful phrasing couldn't disguise his meaning. I told him it wasn't my place to discuss the personal affairs of folks on the ranch. He didn't much care for that answer. Where is he now? Rode toward town. But he'll be back. Had that look about him, like a man with unfinished business? Holt shifted uncomfortably. There's something else, Mr. Creed. He knew things about her. Mentioned her late husband by name, said he had legal matters to discuss regarding Thomas Grace's estate. The blood roared in Magnus's ears. Thomas Grace's estate had been settled months ago, according to Emmeline. All debts paid, all assets, liquidated to cover what her husband owed. What legal matters could possibly remain, and why would someone travel from Denver to discuss them now, just days before her wedding? Magnus found Emmeline in the nursery she'd been preparing, carefully folding tiny clothes that Martha had sewn from soft cotton fabric. She looked up at his entrance, her face glowing with the contentment that had characterized her recent weeks. The sight of her happiness made what he had to tell her even more difficult. "We need to talk." Something in his tone dimmed her smile. "What's wrong?" Magnus closed the door behind him and moved to the window, needing the distance to maintain his composure. "There was a visitor here today, a man asking questions about you, about Thomas's estate." He watched her reflection in the glass, saw how her hands stilled on the baby clothes. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest your late husband's affairs weren't as settled as you believed." Magnus turned to face her. "Emmeline, is there anything about Thomas's business dealings that you haven't told me? Any debts or obligations that might have survived his death?" "No," but her voice lacked conviction. "That is, I thought. Thomas handled most of the business side of things. I knew about the farm loans, the money owed to the grain merchants, but he said those were manageable. What about business partners? Anyone who might have had claims on the estate?" Emmeline sank into the rocking chair, her hands moving protectively to her belly. "There was James Whitmore. He and Thomas had some kind of arrangement regarding wheat futures, but I was never involved in those discussions. After Thomas died, James came to the funeral and offered to help settle affairs, but I was so overwhelmed." "What kind of help?" "He said Thomas owed him money from a business venture that had gone wrong. He offered to forgive the debt in exchange. If for other considerations." Her cheeks colored with remembered shame. "He suggested that as Thomas's widow, I had certain obligations to his business partners." Magnus felt rage building in his chest. "What kind of obligations?" "Marriage. He claimed that Thomas had promised my hand as surety for a loan, that it was a legally binding agreement." Emmeline's voice grew stronger with indignation. "I told him that was impossible, that Thomas would never make such an arrangement without my knowledge. James insisted it was all properly documented, but when I demanded to see the papers, he became unpleasant." "Unpleasant how?" "He said I was a naive woman who didn't understand business, that fighting him would only impoverish." me further. He gave me time to come to my senses, but I used that time to sell everything and leave instead. She looked up at Magnus with eyes that held both fear and defiance. I thought distance would end it. I never imagined he'd follow me here. Magnus knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. Whatever documents he claims to have, whatever agreements he says Thomas made, they can't be legally binding. You can't be compelled to marry someone against your will. Can't I? Women have few rights in these matters, Magnus. If he can prove Thomas pledged my marriage as security for a debt, she shuddered. What if the courts agree with him? The possibility sent cold fear through Magnus's chest. He'd assumed Emmeline's past was settled, that marriage to him would seal her safely away from whatever hardships had driven her to his door. The thought of losing her now, just when he'd found the courage to love again, was unbearable. "We'll fight him," Magnus said firmly. "Whatever legal claims he thinks he has, we'll challenge them. You're under my protection now, and the Creed name carries weight in this territory." But even as he spoke the words, Magnus wondered if his influence would be enough to protect the woman he loved from a past that refused to stay buried. James Whitmore arrived at Stonewall Ranch the following morning with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. He was younger than Magnus had expected, perhaps 35, with the soft look of someone who'd made his fortune through calculation rather than physical labor. His expensive suit and polished boots marked him as a man of means. But there was something calculating in his pale eyes that set Magnus's teeth on edge. "Mr. Creed, I presume." Whitmore dismounted with practiced ease, though Magnus noticed he favored his left leg slightly. "James Whitmore of Denver, I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I have a great many things, Mr. Whitmore." "You'll need to be more specific." "Emmeline Grace, my late partner's widow." Whitmore withdrew a leather portfolio from his saddlebags, handling it like a weapon. "I have documents here that prove she's legally bound to honor certain agreements her husband made before his untimely death." Magnus stepped down from the porch, positioning himself between Whitmore and the house where Emmeline waited. "Mrs. Grace is under my protection. Any business you had with her husband died with him. I'm afraid that's not how commercial law works in civilized territories." Whitmore's smile held no warmth. "Thomas Grace entered into a binding contract with my firm using his wife's future as collateral. When he defaulted on his obligations, those rights transferred to me as his surviving partner. Show me these documents." Whitmore opened the portfolio with theatrical precision, withdrawing several official-looking papers. Articles of partnership between Thomas Grace and Whitmore Commercial Ventures, dated 18 months ago. You'll note the clause on page 3 regarding personal guarantees. Magnus examined the papers with growing unease. The legal language was dense and formal, full of whereas clauses and conditional statements that would require a lawyer's expertise to fully understand. But one section was clear enough. In exchange for a substantial loan, Thomas Grace had pledged all assets of the partnership, including but not limited to personal guarantees extending to family members. "This is meaningless legal gibberish," Magnus said, though doubt crept into his voice. "A man can't pledge his wife like livestock." "Can't he? The territorial courts have upheld similar agreements when properly documented. Mrs. Grace became part of the partnership assets when Thomas signed this contract. His death doesn't void my claim, it activates it. Even if this document were legitimate, which I doubt, Emmeline was never informed of these arrangements. No contract is binding without the consent of all parties." Whitmore's laugh was unpleasant. "Women don't require consent for their husbands' business decisions, Mr. Creed. Thomas Grace had every legal right to pledge his wife's future to secure his debts. The fact that he chose not to inform her is irrelevant." Magnus felt fury building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What exactly are you claiming?" "Simple. Mrs. Grace returns with me to Denver, where she'll fulfill her late husband's obligations through marriage to me. In exchange, I'll forgive the substantial debt Thomas accumulated through failed speculation. It's really quite generous. She gains a husband of means and escapes the poverty her husband's poor decisions created. And if she refuses, then I'll pursue the debt through territorial courts. Thomas Grace owed my firm over $8,000 when he died. Money I can legally claim from his estate, including any assets his widow has acquired since his death. Whitmore's gaze traveled meaningfully toward the ranch house. I understand she's found employment here. Any wages she's earned, any property she's acquired, any arrangements she's made would be subject to seizure. The threat was clear and calculated. Magnus realized Whitmore had researched their situation thoroughly, knowing that Emmeline's pregnancy would make her vulnerable, and that Magnus's feelings for her could be leveraged. "You're assuming the documents are genuine," Magnus said carefully. "I'll want them examined by qualified legal counsel before acknowledging any claims. Of course, I'll be staying at the hotel in Cedar Falls while you arrange for appropriate review. But Mr. Creed," Whitmore's voice took on a harder edge, "I'd advise against delay. The longer Mrs. Grace remains here, the more complicated her situation becomes. Territorial authorities take a dim view of unmarried women living in irregular circumstances. The threat to Emmeline's reputation was as calculated as everything else about Whitmore's approach." Magnus understood now that this wasn't just about money or legal obligations. It was about control, about a man who decided to claim a woman regardless of her wishes. "1 week," Magnus said. "I'll have the documents reviewed within 1 week." Generous. "And Mr. Creed, I trust Mrs. Grace will remain available for consultation during this period. It would be unfortunate if she were to disappear again before these matters are resolved." As Whitmore rode away, Magnus clutched the marriage certificate Emmeline had shown him weeks ago, proof of her widowhood and the only weapon he had against a man who seemed determined to steal his future. The Stonewall Ranch deed lay spread across Magnus's desk like a battle plan, its heavy parchment and official seals representing 20 years of backbreaking work and careful investment. He'd retrieved it from the safe along with every other document of value he possessed, preparing for a gamble that could cost him everything he'd built. "You can't be serious about this," Holt said from across the room. His weathered face creased with disbelief. "Signing over the ranch? Magnus, that's 20,000 acres and more cattle than a man can count. It's land and livestock, nothing more." Magnus kept his voice steady, though the words felt like glass in his throat. "What's the point of an empire if I have no one to share it with?" Martha entered carrying a tea service, her movements sharp, with disapproval. "That Whitmore creature has been in town for 3 days, telling anyone who'll listen that Mrs. Emmeline is legally his property. The whole territory's buzzing with gossip." Magnus had heard the reports. Whitmore was conducting himself like a man certain of victory, buying drinks for anyone willing to listen to his version of events. According to him, he was a wronged business partner seeking justice, while Emmeline was a deceitful widow attempting to escape her lawful obligations. "Where is Emmeline now?" "In the nursery, same as she's been since that man arrived. Won't come down for meals, barely speaks except to ask if there's been word from the lawyer." Martha's voice softened with maternal concern. "She's frightening. Herself sick with worry." Magnus had sent a rider to Denver with Whitmore's documents, seeking legal counsel from the territorial capital's most respected firm. But even if the papers proved fraudulent, the damage to Emmeline's reputation might be irreversible. Unmarried, pregnant, and now the subject of scandal, she would find few places willing to offer her sanctuary. The lawyer's opinion won't matter. "If Whitmore takes this to territorial court," Magnus said, making his decision, "but if Emmeline becomes my wife before any legal proceedings begin, her status changes completely. As Mrs. Magnus Creed, she'd have protections that a widow lacks." "And if that's not enough?" Holt asked. "If this Whitmore fellow has real legal claims?" Magnus touched the ranch deed with fingers that trembled slightly. "Then I'll give him what he's really after, enough money to disappear and leave us in peace. The ranch is worth far more than $8,000. If necessary, I'll deed it over to satisfy any claims against Thomas Grace's estate." "You'd give up everything for her?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Magnus thought of Sarah, of the dreams they'd shared and the future that death had stolen. Then he thought of Emmeline, of the way she'd brought life back to his empty house and hope back to his guarded heart. Love, he realized, wasn't about protecting what you had. It was about risking everything for what mattered most. "Yes," he said simply, "I'd give up everything." A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Emmeline appeared in the doorway, pale, but composed, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "May I come in?" Magnus rose immediately, crossing to her with concern. "You should be resting. I should be facing this." Her voice carried the steel he'd admired from their first meeting. "I've been hiding upstairs like a child while you try to solve my problems. That's not fair to you, and it's not who I want to be." She moved to the desk, where the ranch deed lay open, studying it with growing understanding. "You're planning to sacrifice the ranch to protect me. I'm planning to protect my future wife by any means necessary. Even if it means losing everything you've spent your life building." Magnus cupped her face in his hands, seeing his own determination reflected in her dark eyes. "Emmeline, before you came here, this was just property. Valuable, but empty. You made it a home. Without you, it's nothing but land and livestock again." Tears gathered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "And what if I told you there was another way? What if I went with Whitmore willingly, ended this threat without costing you your life's work?" The suggestion hit Magnus like a physical blow. "You can't seriously be considering that. I'm considering what's best for everyone. If I marry Whitmore, his legal claims disappear, your ranch stays safe, and our child grows up with a father who can provide security." "Our child grows up with a father who loves them," Magnus corrected fiercely. "You think I could let you sacrifice yourself to that man? You think I could live with myself knowing I let you go? Then what do you suggest?" Magnus picked up the ranch deed, folding it carefully. "I suggest we stop running from this fight and start winning it. Tomorrow we'll ride to town together and face whatever legal challenges Whitmore wants to bring. If he wants to claim you belong to him, he'll have to do it in front of the whole territory. And if he can prove his legal rights, then he'll discover that some things are worth more than legal documents." Magnus's voice carried a hardness that made even Holt look up sharply. "The Creed name means something in this territory. It's time James Whitmore learned exactly what that means." The Cedar Falls Courthouse had never seen such a gathering. News of the dispute had drawn spectators from across the territory, packing the small building with ranchers, townspeople, and curious onlookers eager to witness the confrontation between Magnus Creed and the stranger who claimed legal rights. To his intended bride, Judge Harrison presided with the gravity befitting his position as territorial magistrate. A fair man with 20 years' experience in frontier law, he'd heard every variety of dispute the harsh land could produce. But this case troubled him. The documents Whitmore presented appeared legitimate, their legal language precise and intimidating. Yet something about the man himself raised uncomfortable questions. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Harrison said, adjusting his spectacles, "you claim Mrs. Grace is legally bound to honor agreements made by her late husband. Please state your case." Whitmore rose with theatrical confidence, his expensive suit marking him as an outsider among the work-worn crowd. "Your Honor, Thomas Grace entered into a binding partnership with my firm 18 months ago. When his speculation in wheat futures failed catastrophically, he pledged personal assets as collateral, including future considerations regarding his wife's status. The contract is clear and legally binding, and Mrs. Grace was aware of these arrangements. Awareness is not required for a husband's legal commitments, Your Honor. Mr. Grace had every right to pledge his wife's future to secure business debts." Magnus felt Emmeline's hand tighten in his as Whitmore spoke. She sat beside him with quiet dignity, her pregnancy visible despite her best efforts to conceal it. The sight of her vulnerability in the face of Whitmore's calculated cruelty made Magnus's blood burn with protective fury. "Mr. Creed," the judge continued, "you dispute these claims." Magnus rose slowly, his presence filling the small courtroom. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to respect. "I dispute everything about this man's character and claims, Your Honor. But more than that, I question the timing of his appearance." "Explain." "Mrs. Grace has been a widow for over 6 months. If Mr. Whitmore's claims were legitimate, why wait until now to pursue them? Why allow her to travel hundreds of miles before asserting his supposed rights?" Magnus's gaze fixed on Whitmore with predatory intensity. Unless those rights were fabricated for the occasion. Whitmore's composure flickered briefly. "I was conducting business in California and only recently learned of Thomas's death. As soon as I discovered Mrs. Grace's location, I came immediately to resolve these matters." "Convenient," Magnus replied. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, what exactly was the nature of your business partnership with Thomas Grace?" "Wheat futures speculation, as I've already stated." "And you have records of these transactions? Correspondence with grain exchanges, bank drafts, warehouse receipts?" For the first time, Whitmore hesitated. "The records were, unfortunately, lost in a fire that destroyed my Denver offices last month." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Magnus pressed his advantage. "How unfortunate. So we have only your word regarding the existence of these business dealings. The partnership agreement speaks for itself." "Does it?" "Your Honor, I've had these documents examined by legal counsel in Denver." Magnus withdrew a telegram from his vest pocket. "According to territorial records, Whitmore Commercial Ventures was not legally incorporated until 3 months after Thomas Grace's death. The company couldn't have entered into partnerships that predate its existence." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Whitmore's face flushed, but he maintained his composure. "Clerical errors in territorial filings are common. The substance of the agreement remains valid." "Furthermore," Magnus continued, "I've received communication from the Denver business community regarding Mr. Whitmore's reputation." He unfolded a second telegram. "It seems he's currently under investigation for fraudulent business practices involving widows and disputed estates." Judge Harrison leaned forward with sharp interest. "Mr. Whitmore, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Before Whitmore could answer, the courthouse door burst open. A telegraph operator rushed in, clutching a yellow message form. "Urgent telegram for Judge Harrison from the Denver Territorial Marshal's office." The judge read the message quickly, his expression growing severe. "Mr. Whitmore, it appears there's a warrant for your arrest in Denver on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The Territorial Marshal is requesting your immediate detention pending extradition." Whitmore's careful facade crumbled entirely. "This is preposterous. I'm a legitimate businessman pursuing lawful claims." "You're a confidence man who preys on vulnerable women," Magnus said, rising to his full height, "and your scheme ends here." As the territorial deputy moved to arrest Whitmore, the fraudulent businessman's eyes found Emmeline with desperate fury. "You think you've won? Even without the contracts, you're still carrying a dead man's bastard. What respectable man would want damaged goods like you?" The insult hung in the air for barely a heartbeat before Magnus's fist connected with Whitmore's jaw, sending the smaller man crashing into the defendant's table. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause as Magnus flexed his bruised knuckles with satisfaction. "Order! Order!" Judge Harrison pounded his gavel, though his expression suggested approval rather than censure. "Mr. Creed, while I cannot officially condone violence in my courtroom, I must say that some provocations exceed any reasonable man's patience." As Whitmore was led away in chains, Magnus turned to Emmeline and saw tears of relief streaming down her face. The nightmare was over, and their future stretched ahead unobstructed and bright. The wedding veil had been Martha's contribution to the hastily arranged ceremony, a delicate length of ivory lace that had belonged to her own grandmother. She'd presented it to Emmeline that morning with tears in her eyes and a kiss on both cheeks, declaring that every bride needed something old to bless her marriage with the wisdom of generations past. "You look beautiful," Martha whispered as she arranged the veil over Emmeline's dark hair, "like an angel sent to bring this house back to life." Emmeline studied her reflection in the bedroom mirror, hardly recognizing the radiant woman looking back at her. The cream-colored dress Martha had sewn was simple but elegant, its flowing lines accommodating her advanced pregnancy while maintaining dignity and grace. The grandmother's engagement ring caught the afternoon light, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly beautiful again. "I still can't believe it's real," she murmured, one hand resting on her rounded belly. "This morning I thought I might lose everything. Now you're about to become Mrs. Magnus Creed," Martha finished with satisfaction. "And not a moment too soon, if you ask me. That man's been wandering around this ranch like a lost soul for 3 years. You've given him purpose again." Downstairs, the great room had been transformed for the ceremony. Every ranch hand not essential to daily operations had gathered, along with neighbors from miles around who'd come to witness the union. Word of the morning's courtroom drama had spread quickly, and the community's relief at Whitmore's exposure had turned the wedding into a celebration of justice as well as love. Magnus waited at the makeshift altar the men had constructed from lumber and wildflowers, his usually stern expression soft with anticipation. He'd changed from his court clothes into his finest suit, a dark blue wool that emphasized his broad shoulders and made his silver-touched hair look distinguished rather than aged. Holt stood beside him as best man, grinning like a proud father. The minister from Cedar Falls, a kind-faced man named Reverend Porter, smiled warmly as Emmeline appeared at the top of the stairs. "Dearly beloved," he began as she descended slowly, "we are gathered here today to witness the joining of two souls who have found in each other the completion they sought." Magnus met her at the bottom of the stairs, offering his arm with a tenderness that made her heart skip. "Ready?" he whispered. "More than ready." They took their places before the altar, hands joined, eyes locked on each other's faces. The words of the ceremony washed over them like gentle rain, promises of love, honor, fidelity, and mutual support through whatever trials life might bring. When the moment came to exchange vows, Magnus's voice carried clearly through the room. "Emmeline, you came to me in the darkest season of my life and brought light back to spaces that had known only shadow. I promise to love you, protect you, and cherish the family we're building together. I promise to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me and to never take for granted the gift of your heart." Emmeline's response came without hesitation, her voice strong despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Magnus, you gave me sanctuary when I had nowhere else to turn. But more than that, you gave me hope for a future I thought was lost. I promise to stand beside you in building something beautiful and lasting, to be your partner in all things, and to love you with all the strength I possess." The rings, his grandmother's engagement ring joined by a matching wedding band, sealed their promises. But before Reverend Porter could pronounce them husband and wife, Emmeline gasped and doubled over, her hand flying to her belly. "Oh," she breathed, looking up at Magnus with wonder and alarm. I think the baby's coming." Chaos erupted in the great room. Martha rushed forward with practiced efficiency, while the men scattered like startled cattle. Magnus swept Emmeline into his arms, carrying her toward the stairs as she breathed through what was unmistakably a contraction. "Not now," she panted against his shoulder. "We haven't finished the ceremony. The important parts are done," Magnus assured her, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "You're my wife now, and this baby is going to be born into a proper family." Martha had already begun organizing the bedroom, sending ranch hands for hot water and clean linens, while shouting instructions about fetching the doctor from town. But Emmeline's labor progressed too quickly for outside help. Within 2 hours of her first contraction, Magnus found himself delivering his own son with Martha's guidance and his wife's fierce determination. James Thomas Creed entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the house like a proclamation of new life. Magnus held his son, for the child was indisputably his now, regardless of biology, and felt his heart expand beyond anything he'd thought possible. "Hello, little one," he whispered, placing the baby in Emmeline's waiting arms. "Welcome to Stonewall Ranch." Looking at his wife and son, both healthy and perfect in the golden afternoon light, Magnus understood that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as desperate strangers on winter nights. Love had found him when he'd stopped looking for it, and family had bloomed from the most unlikely circumstances. The veil lay draped over a chair, forgotten in the excitement, but its blessing had already taken hold. 3 generations of wisdom, binding this new family together with threads stronger than lace. The silver rattle arrived 3 weeks after the baby's birth, delivered by a delegation of townspeople who came bearing gifts and formal apologies. Mrs. Millicent Ashford led the group, her previous disapproval transformed into effusive praise for the new Mrs. Creed and her remarkable son. "Such a beautiful child," she cooed, admiring little James as he slept in his mother's arms, the very image of his father, with those strong Creed features. "And my dear Emmeline, you look positively radiant. Motherhood suits you perfectly." Emmeline accepted the compliments with gracious patience, though Magnus caught the amused glint in her eyes. The same woman who'd written poison letters about an unmarried pregnant woman now gushed over the respectably wed Mrs. Magnus Creed. The transformation was complete. Emmeline had evolved from scandalous interloper to beloved community matriarch in the space of a single ceremony. "We wanted to present you with this small token of our esteem," Mrs. Ashford continued, producing the ornate silver rattle with ceremonial flourish. "It's inscribed with the Creed family crest and young James's birth date, a proper heirloom for a proper family." Magnus accepted the gift with appropriate dignity, though privately he marveled at how quickly public opinion could shift. 3 weeks ago, these same people had whispered about Emmeline's virtue. Now they competed to claim association with Stonewall, Ranch's newest success story. After the visitors departed, Magnus found Emmeline in the nursery, nursing their son, while humming a gentle lullaby. The sight never failed to move him. This woman who'd arrived desperate and destitute, now glowing with contentment as she nurtured their child. The transformation was so complete, it sometimes seemed like a dream. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, looking up with the warm smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. "I was thinking about how much has changed. 6 months ago, I was a bitter widower, convinced I'd never feel anything but grief again. Now you're a husband and father with a baby who keeps you awake half the night," Emmeline finished with gentle teasing. "Now I'm the luckiest man in Dakota Territory," Magnus corrected, settling into the rocking chair beside hers. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your independence for life with a stubborn rancher and his complicated past?" Emmeline's laughter was soft and musical. "Magnus Creed, I traded desperation for security, loneliness for love, and uncertainty for the strongest man I've ever known. If that's not the best bargain a woman ever made, I don't know what is." James finished nursing and dozed against his mother's shoulder, tiny fist clutching her finger with surprising strength. Magnus marveled at how perfectly the child fit into their lives, as if he'd always been meant to complete their family. The boy showed no trace of his biological father's features. Instead, he seemed to embody the best of both his parents' spirits. "The territorial governor's office sent word today," Magnus mentioned casually. "They're recommending me for appointment to the Territorial Development Commission. It would mean trips to Denver, meetings with railroad officials, influence over how this region grows." "That's wonderful. You've certainly earned the recognition. I wanted to discuss it with you first. The position would require entertaining important visitors, hosting formal events. You'd be expected to serve as hostess for political functions." Emmeline considered this thoughtfully. Are you asking if I'm capable of such responsibilities? Or if I'm willing to accept them? Neither. I'm asking if you want that kind of life. You've had enough of being told what your role should be. The question revealed how deeply Magnus understood her. 6 months of marriage had taught him to see past her gentle exterior to the steel beneath, the woman who'd survived poverty, widowhood, and near destitution through sheer determination. She'd earned the right to choose her own path. I think, she said slowly, that I'd enjoy the opportunity to help shape this territory's future, especially if it means ensuring other women in desperate circumstances find better options than I had. What do you mean? I mean using whatever influence we have to create opportunities, schools, medical facilities, programs for widows and orphans. If I'm to be the Queen Mother of Stonewall Ranch, I intend to rule with purpose. Magnus felt pride swell in his chest. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with, not content with mere security, but determined to build something meaningful for future generations. Together, they could create a legacy that extended far beyond cattle and land ownership. Then we'll accept the appointment, he decided, but with one condition, which is that James comes with us to Denver when he's old enough. I want our son to understand that his inheritance isn't just wealth, but responsibility to the people who depend on us. Emmeline's smile was radiant. I think Nana Rose would approve. She always said the best people were those who left the world better than they found it. As evening settled over Stonewall Ranch, the silver rattle caught the lamplight from its place on the mantel, a symbol of acceptance, legitimacy, and the bright future stretching ahead for the family that had found each other against all odds. 5 years later, the family portrait hung in the place of honor above the great room fireplace, a testament to the improbable journey that had transformed 3 strangers into an unbreakable family. Magnus stood behind his seated wife, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, while the other held their daughter Rose, barely 2 years old and already showing signs of her mother's gentle determination. James, now a sturdy 5-year-old, with his father's dark hair and his mother's compassionate eyes, stood between his parents with the confident bearing of a child who'd never known uncertainty. Beside him, baby Thomas, named for Emmeline's first husband in a gesture of healing rather than grief, gurgled contentedly in Emmeline's arms. "Tell us the story again, Mama," James requested from his perch on the sofa, his favorite bedtime ritual. "About the winter when you found Papa." Emmeline smiled, settling more comfortably in the rocking chair that had once belonged to Sarah, but now belonged to their growing family's bedtime traditions. "Well," she began, her voice taking on the measured cadence of beloved repetition. "It was the coldest winter anyone could remember, and a very desperate woman was walking through the snow." Magnus listened from his desk, where he reviewed correspondence from the territorial capital, his responsibilities now extending far beyond Stonewall Ranch to include schools, hospitals, and programs for struggling families throughout the region. Emmeline had indeed become a queen mother in the truest sense, wielding her influence like a gentle sword to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As his wife's voice wove the familiar tale of hardship transformed into hope, Magnus reflected on the wisdom of accepting unexpected gifts. The woman who'd collapsed at his gate seeking nothing more than shelter had brought him everything he hadn't known he'd lost: purpose, joy, a future worth building. Outside, snow began to fall again, but this time it looked like blessing rather than judgment. The house was warm, filled with laughter and love, and the portrait above the fireplace captured a truth Magnus had learned through bitter experience. Sometimes the greatest treasures came disguised as desperate strangers on winter nights, and the bravest thing a man could do was open his door to possibility.